April 1912. The world was buzzing with excitement over the grandest ship ever built, a marvel of human engineering and luxury, the Titanic. Towering above the docks of Southampton, she gleamed under the spring sun, her hull shining like a jewel, promising safety, comfort, and a new beginning to everyone on board. For the wealthy, she was a palace afloat. For immigrants, she was a gateway to America and a better life. Yet far beneath the opulence, in the roaring engine rooms, where coal dust clung to every surface and the heat was so intense it burned the skin, a man named Joseph Bell quietly went about his work. Born in Carlisle, England, Bell had spent decades mastering steam engines, understanding every bolt, valve, and boiler with the precision of an artist. To most passengers, he was invisible, one of the many men whose tireless labor made the ship move and the lights glow. But on that fateful night, his choices would define heroism in its purest form. While the world above laughed, dined, and dreamed, Joseph Bell and his team prepared to face challenges no one else could foresee. What would it mean to stay behind, knowing the sea could claim your life at any moment, to work not for fame or fortune, but to give strangers a chance to live? This question would soon define the very essence of courage as the Titanic sailed confidently into history, unaware of the iceberg that awaited, silently poised to test the limits of human bravery and selflessness.
On April 10, 1912, Titanic left Southampton Harbor, her massive hull cutting through the calm waters of the English Channel as passengers waved goodbye, unaware that they were part of history in the making. The decks buzzed with excitement. Well-dressed women in flowing gowns chatted with their companions, children laughed and ran along the promenades, and wealthy businessmen toasted to new opportunities in America. Below deck, however, life was a stark contrast. The engine rooms were a furnace of relentless activity. Coal dust coated every surface, steam hissed from the boilers, and the heat was almost unbearable. But Joseph Bell and his team worked tirelessly, ensuring that the engines ran smoothly. Every day, hundreds of tons of coal were shoveled into the boilers, the pistons pumped rhythmically, and the lifeblood of the Titanic, her power, flowed steadily through the ship. Bell was meticulous and disciplined. He knew the mechanics of every engine and boiler like the lines on his own hands. The stokers, trimmers, and oilers respected him, not just for his skill, but for his fairness and calm leadership. While passengers dined in luxury or strolled along the sunlit decks, Bell was immersed in a world few ever saw, surrounded by the relentless roar of machinery and the ever-present threat of danger. Despite the monotony and heat, he approached his work with a quiet pride, knowing that every bolt tightened, every valve monitored, was a contribution to the lives of those above. Life on board Titanic was a study in contrasts. In first class, the wealthy dined on fine cuisine prepared by chefs who moved like artists in ornate kitchens. In third class, immigrants shared cramped quarters, full of hope and dreams for the life that awaited them in America. Children peeked through portholes at the endless sea, while sailors and crew navigated the daily complexities of maintaining a vessel of unprecedented size. The ship itself was a marvel. Luxury cabins, grand staircases, a swimming pool, and even a squash court, all powered by the complex machinery below. The journey was smooth at first, giving passengers a false sense of invincibility. Every evening, the ship's band played cheerful music, echoing across the decks. Joseph Bell and his team maintained a constant vigil below, aware that the sea was both beautiful and unforgiving. They checked gauges, monitored steam pressure, and made minor repairs as needed. Their labor went unnoticed, but without it, the grandeur above would have been impossible. Every day, Bell silently reminded himself and his men that their work was not just technical. It was a shield against disaster, an invisible barrier between safety and catastrophe. The night of April 14, 1912, was clear and cold. The Atlantic stretched endlessly under a velvet sky, studded with stars that reflected in the black, icy waters. Titanic glided majestically, her massive hull cutting through the ocean like a knife, seemingly invincible. On the decks, passengers were enjoying the evening. First-class passengers promenading under soft lights, children laughing in the fresh night air, and the band playing a soft tune that drifted across the ship. In the lower decks, however, Joseph Bell and his team of engineers were immersed in the usual routine, checking gauges, adjusting valves, shoveling coal into the boilers, and keeping the engines running smoothly. The warm roar of the engines and the hiss of the steam filled the air, the heartbeat of the Titanic, a heartbeat that Bell knew intimately. Suddenly, at 11:40 p.m., a shudder ran through the entire ship. It was not subtle. It was violent and jarring, a bone-deep impact that made the steel of the hull groan. Bells rang in the corridors, passengers stumbled, and somewhere above, silver trays rattled in the dining halls. On the bridge, officers exchanged tense glances. There had been ice warnings earlier in the day, but the calm night had lulled everyone into a false sense of safety. Now, reality struck. Literally. The Titanic had collided with an iceberg. Below deck, Joseph Bell felt it immediately. The vibration reverberated through the engines, through the steel floors and walls, into every part of his being. Coal dust floated in the air as the boilers shuddered. Steam hissed violently from pipes that were strained beyond their usual limits. Bell knew instantly that this was no ordinary bump. "Water's coming in fast," he muttered, and instinctively began assessing the compartments. His engineers, loyal and disciplined, gathered around, awaiting instructions. They looked to him not just for technical guidance, but for reassurance in the chaos that now threatened to undo everything they had built.
Above deck, confusion erupted. Passengers, unaware of the true danger below, questioned the meaning of the tremor. Crew members rushed to investigate. Some peered over the rails into the black water. Others dashed to the bridge with questions, shouting, "What happened?" Captain Edward Smith was informed immediately. He gave orders to assess the damage and keep the ship moving as best as possible, hoping that the iceberg had only scratched the hull. But soon, the gravity of the situation became evident. Several compartments were flooding, and Titanic's unsinkable reputation would be tested in ways no human could anticipate. The crew began organizing, sending messages via the Marconi wireless. SOS signals were transmitted into the cold night, the operators working frantically while chaos swirled around them. Passengers began to realize something was seriously wrong as water seeped into lower cabins, and some began to panic. Women and children were instructed to go to the lifeboats, while the officers tried to maintain order amidst the confusion. First-class passengers clung to dignity, unsure whether to believe the ship could really sink. Third-class passengers, often confined to the lower decks, were confused and frightened, relying entirely on crew directions. Down in the engine rooms, Joseph Bell coordinated with his team with a calm intensity that belied the danger around them. Steam hissed in the hot, suffocating air. Water seeped through cracks and began to pool on the floors. Machinery groaned as pressure rose in the boilers. Bell moved from engine to engine, shouting instructions, checking gauges, sealing valves, and adjusting pressure. Every action he took was critical. A single mistake could accelerate the flooding or cause an explosion. His men followed him without hesitation, trusting his experience, knowing that the lives of thousands above depended on their endurance. The minutes dragged on like hours. Each second brought a rise in tension, the icy water inching closer to the boilers. Steam scalded the faces of the engineers. Sweat and fear mixed in the stifling heat. Bell barked orders, kept morale steady, and reminded his men that they were the last barrier between the passengers and catastrophe. The distant sound of rushing water, the clatter of objects falling above, and the cries of terrified passengers reached their ears, but they did not falter. Every turn of the engine, every adjustment of a valve was a small act of heroism. Without the engineers' dedication, the pumps would fail, the lights would go out, and the lifeboats would descend into darkness. Bell understood this completely, and he bore the weight of that responsibility silently, knowing that the cost would be the highest he and his men could pay. He looked around at their faces, young men, exhausted but resolute, and nodded firmly. "Stay at your posts," he said. "Keep her alive as long as we can." And they did, as the Titanic began the slow, inexorable process of succumbing to the sea. The night had passed. The icy waters of the North Atlantic, once glittering under a starlit sky, had swallowed the Titanic in silence, leaving only darkness, drifting debris, and shattered dreams. Those who had survived clung to lifeboats, shivering not just from the freezing cold, but from the horror and disbelief of what had just unfolded. Above them, the cries of women and children mingled with the low moans of exhausted men. Each survivor carried in their memory the final moments aboard Titanic, the blaring alarms, the frantic rush to lifeboats, the chaos of frightened passengers, and the haunting sight of lights flickering in the distance as if refusing to surrender to the icy deep. The stories of those final hours spread quickly among the survivors. Many spoke of the musicians who continued playing to calm passengers, of officers who guided lifeboats with courage, and of the women and children who were saved by the bravery of others. Yet in these accounts, one group of heroes remained largely invisible, the engineers who had stayed behind in the engine rooms, including Joseph Bell, William Parr, Thomas Andrews, and their dedicated teams. It was their labor that had kept the lights on, the wireless sending SOS signals, and the engines running long enough for countless lives to be saved. Without their selfless devotion, the horror above deck would have been far worse. The Titanic disaster also left a profound cultural and philosophical legacy. It became a cautionary tale of human hubris, a testament to the limits of technology, and a story of the extraordinary courage found in ordinary people. Joseph Bell, an ordinary man by society's standards, became extraordinary through his actions. He exemplified the moral principle that true heroism does not seek recognition, but acts because it is right, because lives depend upon it, and because duty demands it. He and his team chose to stay behind so that hundreds of others might live. That choice defines heroism not as a public display, but as a private act of devotion under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. As the years passed, memorials, museums, and documentaries gradually began to honor Bell and his team appropriately. Visitors to maritime museums often pause before plaques that list the engineers' names, imagining the heat, the roar, and the rising waters of that fateful night. They reflect on the ordinary men who became extraordinary through deliberate, selfless action. The narrative of the Titanic is no longer only about the ship, or the iceberg, or the mistakes made. It is also about the human choices that defined life and death. It is about Joseph Bell standing at his post, every detail of his mind and body focused, fully aware of the inevitable, yet refusing to abandon his duty. Ultimately, the story concludes with an enduring lesson. Tragedy reveals character. In the darkest hours, the ordinary have the opportunity to perform extraordinary deeds. The Titanic may have been lost to the sea, but the courage of Joseph Bell and his fellow engineers remains undiminished, an eternal light in human history. They remind us that heroism is not measured in medals or fame, but in moral resolve, in sacrifice, in the willingness to bear the burden of responsibility for the sake of others. Even today, over a century later, their story continues to inspire, to challenge and to teach the world about the depth of human courage, the strength of duty, and the power of selfless action. As the Atlantic waves lap quietly where the Titanic once sailed, the names of Joseph Bell and his team echo silently through history. They went down with the ship, unseen and unheralded, yet their actions saved hundreds. The moral legacy they left behind is profound. In a world that often forgets the quiet acts of courage, these men remind us that true heroism exists not in spectacle, but in steadfast duty, in unwavering courage, and in the choice to stay behind so that others may live.